Good morning, class. I hope you have studied the previous videos and completed the assignment. Today we will going to begin our new fundamental right, that is right against exploitation. Once the right to liberty and equality is granted, it follows that every citizen has a right not to be exploited. Yet, the constitution makers thought it was necessary to write down certain clear provisions to prevent exploitation of the weaker section of the society. In our country, there are millions of people who are underprivileged and deprived. They are subjected to exploitation by their own fellow human beings, and one such form of exploitation in our country has been beggar or forced labor without payment, and another closely related form of exploitation is buying and selling of human beings and using them as slaves. Both of these are prohibited under the Constitution. Forced labor was imposed by landlords, moneylenders, and other wealthy persons in the past. Some form of bonded labor still continues in the country, especially in brick kiln work. It has now been declared a crime and it is a punishable offense. The Constitution also forbids employment of children below the age of 14 years in dangerous jobs like factories and mines. With child labor being made illegal and right to education becoming a fundamental right for children, this right against exploitation has become more meaningful. So Article 23 of the Indian Constitution talks about that or prohibits traffic in human beings, labor, that is forced labor, and other similar forms of forced labor. And Article 24 prohibits the employment of children below the age of 14 years in any factory, mine, or other hazardous activities like construction work or railway. So every individual has a right against exploitation and prohibiting all forms of forced labor, child labor, and traffic in human being. Right against exploitation is given in Article 23 and 24, as we have already discussed, which provides for two provisions: the abolition of trafficking in human beings and forced labor, abolition of employment of children below the age of 14 years in dangerous jobs like factories and mines. Child labor is considered a gross violation of the spirit and provisions of the Constitution. Forced labor practiced in the past by landlords has been declared a crime and is punishable by law. Trafficking in humans for the purpose of slave trade or prostitution is also prohibited by law. An exception is made in employment without payment for compulsory services for public purposes. Compulsory military conscription is covered by this provision. Look at this picture in this slide. What do you think? What this picture is depicting? It's simply showing about that prohibition of traffic in human beings and forced labor, that is mentioned in Article 23. So let us discuss more about it. The expression traffic in human being includes, so the word traffic in human beings, here traffic means selling and buying of human beings, usually women, for immoral purposes. So it includes that selling and buying of men, women, children like goods, and immoral trafficking in women and children, including prostitution. Third, Devdasi. And next is Devdasi simply means a woman who is considered given in marriage to God. It was used to practice in the past. And the fourth, right against exploitation, talked about slavery. That you cannot ask somebody to do as a or to work as a forced labor. So Article 23 that talks about prohibition of traffic in human beings and forced labor, specially categorized into these subheadings. Now, as we have discussed that forced labor or human trafficking is not allowed under Article 23rd. Article 23rd also prohibits other similar forms of forced labor like bonded labor, that is compelling a person to work against his will. The word force includes not only physical or legal force but also force arising from the compulsion of economic circumstances, that is working for less than the minimum wage. Means you cannot take advantage of somebody economic condition and ask them to do as the less wage work and something else is decided by the government. So this also prohibited by our constitution under Article 23. Now observe this picture carefully. What all this picture is depicting? That children are working in factories, they are doing child labor, they are working in bricks factory, or they are working as a labor in crackers factories. So this is very disheartening picture that the small child and their right is to have education, but instead of that they are working as a labor, child labor. So what do you think? What those pictures are about? Isn't it a disturbing fact that child labor was normal for the previous centuries? This article prohibits the employment, Article 24, prohibits the employment of children below the age of 14 years in any factory, mines or other hazardous activities. Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act 1986 is the most important law in this direction. In 1996, the Supreme Court directed the establishment of Child Labor Rehabilitation Welfare Fund, in which the offending employer should deposit a fine of rupees 20,000 for each child employed by him. It also issued directions for the improvement of education, health and nutrition of children. In 2006, the government banned the employment of children as domestic servants or workers in business establishments like hotels, dhabas, restaurants, shops, factories, resorts, spa, tea shops, and so on. So you have to observe this picture and tell that which fundamental right is violated and what are the provisions given by the Constitution to prohibit this fundamental right. Now, based on today's class, there are some assignment questions for you. Before seeing the assignment question, let us recapitulate what we have discussed. In today's class, we have discussed about right against exploitation, that is Article 23 and 24, trafficking in human beings and forced labor, is completely prohibited by the constitution. And next we talked about that employment of children below the age of 14 years, as child labor is also prohibited. But the sad part is this, that still it continues in our country. Small children work as a labor in the factories, as a domestic servants, in hotels, dhabas. So constitution has done the work to eradicate this problem, but the people, the citizens, are not doing it. So it is not every time you will ask for the provisions or for the laws to do some effective work. Laws are there, provisions are there. Now it is our turn to eradicate this child labor completely. So we need to be a keen observer that what exactly happening, because the poor people are not aware of their right. So we need to help them in whichever possible way, because this is the sad fact that child labor and forced labor, that people are working below the minimum wages uh, as decided by the government. People are used to do that because their economic condition are not so good, so they send their children to work as factory labor in mines, and so hazardous situation they are bound to, because they have no option to earn their livelihood. So we need to take steps regarding this. So assignment question are: write a short note on right against exploitation. What do you mean by term forced labor? What is the meaning of the expression traffic in human being? And there is one thought provoking question that Sonu is a small kid of age 8 years, employed by a household as a domestic help. He is the only breadwinner of his family, as his mother is bedridden and father paralyzed. What will you do if you see this? How can you help Sonu? Is this employment justified? So you need to think about the situation, and then you have to write the answer in not less than 300 words. So think and write the reality, that how you're going to help Sonu after understanding his situation. So thank you class, and have a nice day ahead.